When Spain ceded Florida to the United States, the map changed faster than the ground. The Adams-Onis Treaty was signed in 1819 and took effect in 1821. On paper, Florida became American. In practice, it remained a borderland of forests, rivers, swamps, old Spanish towns, Seminole communities, black Seminole settlements, military posts, traders, enslaved people, fugitives from slavery, and settlers arriving with new expectations. For the United States, Florida was supposed to solve a problem. Spain had been too weak to control the territory. American leaders had complained that Seminole towns, Red Stick refugees, and black refugee communities used Florida as a shelter from U.S. power. Southern slaveholders saw the peninsula as a place where enslaved people could escape and where native allies could protect them. Military officers saw it as a security problem. Land-hungry settlers saw opportunity. But acquiring Florida did not make the problem disappear. It brought the United States directly into it. Seminole communities did not view themselves as loose obstacles on an empty map. They had towns, fields, cattle, kinship networks, trade connections, and political leaders. Some families had Creek roots, others had lived in Florida for generations. They were connected to the larger native South, but they were also shaped by Florida itself, its wetlands, hammocks, pine woods, rivers, and refuge spaces. Black Seminoles and other people of African descent were central to this world. Some were fugitives from slavery. Some were born in Florida. Some lived in villages near Seminole towns, paying tribute or maintaining alliances while preserving degrees of autonomy. Their existence challenged the slaveholding order. They knew the land, raised crops and livestock, carried weapons, and understood that American rule could bring slave catchers and forced removal. The United States did not inherit a quiet province. It inherited a contested refuge. Andrew Jackson briefly served as Florida's military governor in 1821. His presence symbolized the new order. The hero of New Orleans and invader of Spanish Florida now stood as the face of American sovereignty. But even Jackson could not simply command Florida into submission. The territory was too large, too difficult, and too politically tangled. The question became whether native and black communities could remain inside a Florida that American settlers increasingly imagined as theirs. The answer would come through treaties, pressure, law, fraud, military force, and resistance. Indian removal was not an abstract policy born only in Washington. It grew from land hunger. Across the Southeast, cotton changed the stakes. The cotton gin, expanding markets, slave labor, and aggressive land speculation made native homelands look to white settlers and planters like wealth waiting behind a legal barrier. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee pushed harder and harder against native sovereignty. Roads, surveys, state laws, debt, and settler intrusion all became tools of pressure. The United States had long claimed that native nations could either assimilate or cede land and move west. Presidents before Jackson had supported versions of civilization policy, treaty-making, and relocation. Missionaries, agents, and officials spoke of farming, schools, Christianity, written laws, and private property as supposed paths to survival. But when native nations adopted some of those tools, it did not protect them. Cherokee leaders built a constitutional government, developed a written legal system, supported education, and published the Cherokee Phoenix. Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Cherokee leaders negotiated, adapted, resisted, and divided over how to respond to U.S. power. These were not societies frozen in time. They were nations making choices under pressure. Yet adaptation could not satisfy the hunger for land. To many Southern politicians, native sovereignty inside state borders became intolerable precisely because it worked. If a native nation could modernize, write laws, run schools, and still keep its land, the entire settler argument weakened. The goal was not simply to make native people change. The goal was to open the land. Slavery intensified everything. Cotton expansion required land and enslaved labor. The same states demanding removal were often the states most invested in plantation growth. Indian removal and the spread of slavery were not separate stories. They moved together across the southern map. Florida fit this pattern, but with an additional fear. In Florida, Seminole resistance was tied in American minds to black freedom. A Seminole town could be described as hostile. A black Seminole settlement could be described as a threat to slavery itself. A refugee could be labeled stolen property. A community defending itself could be treated as criminal. This is why the struggle after the War of 1812 did not fade. The war had broken old native alliances with Britain and helped remove Spanish power from Florida. But the deeper contest over land, slavery, sovereignty, and refuge grew stronger. The United States preferred to make expansion look legal. Treaties gave conquest the appearance of consent. Throughout the 1820s, federal officials pressed native nations in the Southeast to cede land, accept boundaries, and consider removal west of the Mississippi. Some leaders signed under pressure. Some believed limited concessions might preserve what remained. Some were bribed, isolated, or threatened. Some refused and were bypassed. In Creek country, the pressure became explosive. The Treaty of Indian Springs in 1825 became one of the most infamous examples. William McIntosh, a prominent Creek leader with ties to U.S. officials and land interests, signed away vast Creek lands in Georgia. Many Creeks viewed the treaty as illegitimate and a betrayal of national law. McIntosh had violated Creek rules against unauthorized land sales. He was executed by Creek opponents. The crisis showed how U.S. treaty policy could tear native nations apart. American officials often treated a signature as enough, even when the signer lacked the authority to sell a people's homeland. Internal divisions became useful to expansion. A contested agreement could become a weapon. President John Quincy Adams rejected the worst parts of the Indian Springs fraud and negotiated a replacement. But Georgia's hunger did not disappear. State leaders wanted native land now, not after careful federal process. The conflict between Georgia and Washington previewed the larger constitutional crisis that would erupt under Jackson. For native nations, the lesson was grim. Refusing to sell brought pressure. Selling brought loss. Dividing over strategy brought accusations of betrayal. Accepting civilization policy did not secure protection. Appealing to federal law worked only if federal leaders were willing to enforce it. Meanwhile, removal advocates framed the West as a solution. Native nations, they said, could move beyond state pressure and live under federal protection. The promise sounded humane when spoken by officials, but it asked entire peoples to abandon homelands, graves, farms, towns, rivers, and political identity so that white settlement could proceed. In Florida, a similar logic developed. Seminoles were pushed onto reservations by the Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823. The agreement confined them to a central Florida reservation with poor land, limited supplies, and pressure from nearby settlers. It also exposed the unresolved question of black Seminoles and fugitive slaves. Every treaty claimed to settle the problem. Every treaty created the next crisis. The Cherokee Nation became the most visible test of whether law could protect native sovereignty. Cherokee leaders had spent years building institutions that U.S. officials claimed to admire. They adopted a written constitution in 1827. They operated courts and schools. Sequoyah's syllabary made Cherokee literacy a powerful force. The Cherokee Phoenix carried political argument across distances. Leaders such as John Ross used diplomacy, petitions, and law to defend the nation. Then gold was discovered in Georgia in 1828. The pressure sharpened instantly. Georgia extended state law over Cherokee territory, divided Cherokee lands by lottery, and moved to crush Cherokee political authority. The state treated Cherokee sovereignty as an obstacle to be dissolved. The federal government faced a direct question. Would it defend treaty obligations, or would it allow a state to destroy a native nation inside its claimed borders? The Cherokee fought in court. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, the Supreme Court did not grant the full relief the Cherokee sought, but Chief Justice John Marshall described native nations as domestic dependent nations. The phrase captured both recognition and confinement. It acknowledged political existence while placing native nations under the shadow of U.S. power. In Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the court went further. It held that Georgia laws had no force inside Cherokee territory and that relations with native nations belonged to the federal government, not the states. On paper, this was a major Cherokee victory. In practice, it exposed the weakness of law without enforcement. President Andrew Jackson did not use federal power to protect Cherokee sovereignty against Georgia. Whether or not the famous quotation often attributed to him is exact, the reality was clear. The court's decision did not stop Georgia. The machinery of removal kept moving. The Cherokee story mattered for every native nation in the Southeast. If the Cherokee, with written laws, courts, diplomacy, Christianity, newspapers, and a Supreme Court victory, could not secure protection, then who could? In Florida, Seminole leaders watched the same federal government press them toward removal. The lesson was not subtle. Law might speak. Power decided whether anyone listened. Andrew Jackson entered the presidency in 1829 as the most famous military hero in the United States. To supporters, he represented democratic energy, frontier strength, and resistance to elite control. To native nations, his rise carried a different meaning. Jackson had fought Creeks, invaded Florida, seized Spanish posts, and built his reputation on the southern frontier. He saw native sovereignty east of the Mississippi as incompatible with American expansion. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. The law authorized the president to negotiate removal treaties, exchanging native lands in the east for lands west of the Mississippi. Its supporters described removal as voluntary, protective, even benevolent. They claimed native nations could escape state pressure by moving west. But the word voluntary hid the reality. Native nations were being pressured by state laws, settler violence, debt, fraud, military threat, and federal policy. Refusing removal did not mean being left alone. It meant enduring a tightening ring of coercion. Debate over the law was fierce. Opponents warned that removal violated treaties, honor, religion, and justice. Supporters answered with expansionist certainty. The vote was close, but Jackson won. The act did not remove anyone by itself. It created the framework. The work would be done through treaties, pressure campaigns, factional divisions, and, when necessary, force. The Choctaw were the first of the southeastern nations forced into large-scale removal under the new policy. Their removal in the early 1830s became a human disaster of exposure, hunger, disease, and loss. The Creek, Chickasaw, and Cherokee faced their own versions of pressure and removal. Each nation had its own politics and timeline, but the direction was clear. Florida's Seminoles were smaller in number than the Cherokee or Choctaw, but their position was uniquely difficult for the United States. The peninsula's terrain favored resistance. The presence of black Seminoles complicated every negotiation. Slaveholders demanded the return of fugitives. Seminole leaders feared that removal west would expose black allies to enslavement and destroy the autonomy they had built in Florida. Jackson's policy aimed to settle the native question east of the Mississippi. Instead, in Florida, it helped ignite the longest and most expensive Indian War in U.S. history. The Indian Removal Act did not remain theory for long. The first great test came with the Choctaw. Under the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830, Choctaw leaders ceded their remaining homelands east of the Mississippi and accepted removal west. Some leaders believed they were choosing the least destructive option available. They faced Mississippi's pressure, federal determination, and the reality that refusal might bring even worse terms. The removal that followed revealed what federal promises meant on the ground. Thousands of Choctaw people moved west through cold, mud, hunger, disease, and disorganization. Supplies failed, contractors profited, families were separated, old people, children, and the sick suffered terribly. Newspapers sometimes described the removal as tragic, but tragedy did not stop policy. To officials committed to removal, suffering became a problem of management rather than a reason to reverse course. The Creek faced their own tightening circle. Alabama settlers poured into Creek lands even before federal promises were fulfilled. Fraud, debt, violence, and illegal occupation created chaos. Creek leaders tried to navigate a world in which every concession invited another demand. When some Creeks resisted dispossession, the United States treated resistance as disorder. Removal became more coercive, not less. The Cherokee continued to fight through law and diplomacy, but Georgia kept pressing. The Chickasaw negotiated removal with more control over some financial terms, yet still faced the same basic reality. The eastern homeland was being made impossible to keep. These removals mattered in Florida because Seminoles saw the pattern. Officials promised protection in the West. Native people saw hunger, fraud, coercion, and broken assurances. Officials described removal as peaceful. Native people saw soldiers, settlers, state laws, and pressure. Officials claimed treaties represented consent. Native people saw signatures extracted from divided councils and then enforced against entire nations. Seminole resistance did not develop in ignorance. It developed with evidence. Black Seminoles had even more reason to fear the Western promise. If Choctaw and Creek removal could become chaotic and predatory, what would happen to black allies claimed by slaveholders? If the Seminoles were moved near Creeks, who had claims against them, who would protect black families? If federal agents could not prevent suffering during removal, why trust them to prevent enslavement after it? By the mid-1830s, the Southeast had become a region of moving boundaries and broken faith. Roads filled with displaced families, survey lines cut into old homelands, military posts expanded, state governments pressed for jurisdiction, slaveholders demanded fugitives. Federal officials insisted that removal was inevitable. Florida was not isolated from this wider removal world. It was where that world met a people determined to make inevitability fail. The Seminoles had already been pushed once. The Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823 confined them to a reservation in central Florida. The land was often poor, supplies were unreliable, hunting and farming were difficult. Settlers pressed from outside. U.S. officials watched movement, demanded compliance, and continued to raise the issue of alleged fugitive slaves. For Seminole families, the reservation system felt less like protection than containment. Florida itself made containment hard. The peninsula was a world of wetlands, rivers, hammocks, pine flatwoods, prairies, and hidden paths. Seminole and Black Seminole communities knew how to move through it. American soldiers and officials often did not. That geography gave resistance a future. The Black Seminole issue made removal especially dangerous. Many Black Seminoles had relationships with Seminole towns that did not fit U.S. slave law. Some paid tribute, some fought as allies, some lived in separate settlements with their own leaders. To Southern slaveholders, this did not matter. They saw black autonomy as theft and rebellion. They wanted people returned as property. If the Seminoles moved west, what would happen to their black allies? That question haunted every negotiation. U.S. officials often insisted that only people legally claimed as slaves would be returned. Seminoles and Black Seminoles had reasons not to trust those assurances. Removal west would bring them closer to Creek enemies and slave-catching power. It might fracture alliances, expose families, and place Black Seminoles under new danger. White settlers in Florida also pushed aggressively. They wanted security, land, and roads. They accused Seminoles of theft or violence. Seminoles accused settlers of intrusion, abuse, and bad faith. Each incident became part of a growing crisis. By the early 1830s, federal officials wanted a new treaty that would move the Seminoles out of Florida altogether. That treaty would be Payne's Landing. In 1832, a group of Seminole leaders met U.S. officials at Payne's Landing on the Ocklawaha River. The treaty that emerged became the center of the coming war. It said the Seminoles would send a delegation west to inspect lands assigned near the creeks. If the delegation found the land suitable, the Seminoles would remove. The language and process were disputed. U.S. officials treated the agreement as binding. Many Seminoles argued that it was conditional, misunderstood, coerced, or signed by leaders without authority to commit everyone. A delegation did travel west. At Fort Gibson in 1833, U.S. officials pushed the delegates to approve the western land. Again, the meaning of consent became contested. American authorities claimed the Seminoles had agreed. Many Seminoles in Florida rejected that claim. The problem was not only land, it was identity and survival. Moving west meant living near the creeks, some of whom regarded Seminoles as breakaways and had claims against Black Seminoles. It meant leaving Florida's protective terrain. It meant trusting federal promises that had already failed across the Southeast. It meant accepting that the United States could define Seminole consent even when many Seminoles denied giving it. Pressure mounted. U.S. agents demanded preparation for removal. Seminole leaders stalled, debated and resisted. Some considered accommodation, others rejected removal outright. Micanopy, the principal chief, moved cautiously. Osceola, younger and more militant, emerged as one of the most famous voices of defiance. Osceola was not a hereditary head chief, but leadership in crisis does not always follow formal rank. He understood the emotional power of refusal. He spoke to anger that many felt, but not all could safely express. He became a symbol because he dramatized the choice in front of the Seminoles: submit to removal or fight for Florida. U.S. officials increasingly saw resistance as defiance that had to be broken. Seminoles increasingly saw removal as a threat that could not be survived. The treaty machine had produced another paper victory. This time, paper would not be enough. Osceola's legend grew from moments of confrontation. The most famous story places him before Indian agent Wiley Thompson at Fort King, angrily rejecting the removal treaty and driving a knife through the paper. Like many famous frontier scenes, the details have been retold in different forms. But the meaning endured because it captured a real political truth. Osceola refused to let U.S. officials define consent for the Seminoles. Thompson represented the removal policy in Florida. He insisted that the treaty was valid and that removal would proceed. He also controlled annuities and supplies, giving him leverage over Seminole communities already under pressure. Osceola challenged not only a document, but the entire system of coercion around it. The conflict became personal and political. Osceola was arrested at one point and later released after appearing to promise compliance. Whether he meant it, or whether he used the moment to regain freedom, the result was the same. His resistance intensified. Around him, Seminole and Black Seminole networks prepared. Families moved deeper into defensible country. Warriors gathered supplies. Messages traveled through towns and hammocks. Leaders debated timing. Some Seminoles still hoped to avoid full war, but the deadline for removal approached and trust collapsed. Black Seminoles had urgent reasons to resist. Removal could mean enslavement or the loss of hard-won autonomy. Their knowledge of terrain, languages, farming, and warfare made them essential allies. U.S. officials often underestimated how central they were to Seminole resistance. The Florida crisis was not simply a matter of one charismatic warrior. It was a coalition of people who understood that removal threatened everything: land, kinship, political independence, and freedom. By late 1835, the situation was ready to explode. Two targets came into focus. One was Wiley Thompson at Fort King. The other was a column of U.S. soldiers marching under Major Francis Dade. In December 1835, U.S. forces in Florida were scattered, anxious, and underprepared for the scale of resistance forming around them. Major Francis Dade led a column north from Fort Brooke, near present-day Tampa, toward Fort King. His men marched through pine woods, palmetto, and open stretches that seemed quiet but were being watched. The army believed it was moving through dangerous country, but it did not fully grasp the coordination against it. Seminole fighters chose the ground carefully. On December 28, 1835, they attacked Dade's column. The first volley killed Dade and many of his men. The battle became a devastating defeat for the U.S. Army. Almost the entire command was killed. The event shocked the United States and became known as Dade's Battle, or the Dade Massacre in American memory. That same day, Osceola and a small party killed Wiley Thompson near Fort King. The timing made the message unmistakable. Removal would not proceed as an administrative process. It had become war. For Americans, the attacks seemed sudden and horrifying. For Seminoles and Black Seminoles, they came after years of pressure, contested treaties, threats to freedom, and demands to abandon Florida. The opening blows were violent, but they were not without context. News spread quickly. Panic moved through settlements. Militia mobilized. Federal officials called for troops. Newspapers framed the conflict through outrage and fear. Many Americans expected a swift campaign of punishment. They were wrong. Florida would not behave like a conventional battlefield. Roads were few. Wetlands swallowed movement. Heat, disease, insects, and supply problems weakened armies. Seminole fighters used mobility, concealment, and local knowledge. Black Seminole allies helped sustain resistance. Families moved through landscapes that frustrated large columns. The United States had entered a war it did not understand. After Dade's defeat and Thompson's death, American commanders rushed to regain control. General Duncan Clinch moved against Seminole forces near the Withlacoochee River at the end of 1835. The river and surrounding terrain favored defenders who understood the crossings. Seminole fighters under leaders including Osceola and Micanopy used the landscape to blunt American movement. The fighting at the Withlacoochee showed what kind of war this would be. U.S. troops could win ground for a moment, but holding control was another matter. Seminole forces did not need to defend fixed cities. They needed to survive, strike, disappear, and keep their families beyond the reach of removal. The war was not about a single capital or fort. It was about a whole landscape. American commanders faced a frustrating enemy. Seminole forces avoided the kind of decisive battle that U.S. officers wanted. When pressured, they withdrew into swamps and hammocks. When overlooked, they struck roads, settlements, or detachments. Every march required supplies. Every supply line required protection. Every protected road created another target. Florida itself became a combatant. Soldiers from the north and west entered heat and wetlands they had never known. Uniforms rotted, shoes failed, sickness spread, horses struggled, maps misled. A campaign that looked manageable in Washington became exhausting on the ground. The Seminoles also paid a price. Families had to move constantly. Crops and cattle were vulnerable. Towns could be burned. Hunger and displacement followed resistance. But the opening months proved that removal would not be cheap, fast, or simple. The Second Seminole War had begun as a refusal to leave. It would become a grinding contest over whether the United States could force a people out of one of the most difficult landscapes in North America. By early 1836, the United States faced a sobering truth. The Seminoles had not collapsed. Dade's column was destroyed. Thompson was dead. Clinch had fought at the Withlacoochee without ending resistance. Settlers were frightened. Florida's territorial government demanded protection. Washington faced embarrassment. Andrew Jackson, now nearing the end of his presidency, saw one of his central policies challenged by a smaller native nation that refused to disappear. The war also exposed the limits of removal logic. Officials had insisted that removal was orderly, legal, and inevitable. Florida showed what happened when a people rejected that inevitability. Treaties could be disputed. Deadlines could be ignored. Roads could be ambushed. Forts could be isolated. A policy designed in offices could dissolve in swamp water. Black Seminoles made the challenge even sharper. Their resistance reminded slaveholders that the war was not only about native land, it was also about black freedom. Every black Seminole fighter, interpreter, farmer, or scout contradicted the claim that slavery's power was natural and secure. The United States would send more troops. It would spend more money. It would cycle through commanders, strategies, promises, and betrayals. The war would continue for years, becoming the longest and costliest Indian war in U.S. history. It would include negotiations under flags of truce, captures, forced removals, plantation fears, military frustration, and acts of extraordinary endurance by Seminole and Black Seminole communities. But Episode 4 ends at the beginning because the beginning reveals the central truth. Removal was not simply a law passed in 1830. It was a struggle fought town by town, river by river, family by family. The War of 1812 had helped create the conditions for this moment. It weakened British influence, broke Tecumseh's coalition, devastated the Creek world, elevated Andrew Jackson, and helped push Spain out of Florida. The First Seminole War showed that U.S. power would cross borders in the name of security. The Indian Removal Act gave that power a national policy. Payne's Landing tried to turn policy into paperwork. Osceola and the Seminoles turned the paperwork into war. The story from New Orleans to the Withlacoochee is therefore not a side road. It is the road. It shows how a patriotic war against Britain became a continental struggle over who would control land, law, labor, and refuge. It shows how national heroes could become agents of dispossession. It shows how native nations used diplomacy, adaptation, law, and armed resistance when every other path narrowed. For the Seminoles and Black Seminoles, Florida was not a bargaining chip. It was home, refuge, and survival. The next episode will follow the Second Seminole War deeper into its hardest years. The failed campaigns, the capture of Osceola under a flag of truce, the long resistance in the Everglades, and the painful truth that even overwhelming U.S. power could not fully erase Seminole presence in Florida. Episode 4 ends with smoke rising over a peninsula the United States thought it had already acquired. The map said Florida was American. The war proved that maps can lie. The United States expected punishment to restore control. Instead, the war widened. In 1836, Florida became a theater of alarms, patrols, burned settlements, guarded roads, sudden attacks, and failed marches. Columns moved from fort to fort, while Seminole and Black Seminole fighters refused to stand still long enough for a conventional victory. The U.S. Army could occupy a road, a crossing, or a burned town. It could not occupy every hammock, swamp, river bend, and hidden settlement. General Winfield Scott arrived with a plan to crush resistance through coordinated columns. On paper, the strategy looked powerful. In Florida, it broke against distance, heat, rain, bad maps, weak communication, and an opponent who did not fight according to Scott's timetable. When columns converged, Seminoles had often already moved. When troops searched one district, families and fighters slipped into another. The war also became a political embarrassment. Newspapers demanded action, settlers demanded protection. Officers blamed terrain, supplies, militia discipline, and each other. Washington kept discovering that sending more men did not automatically create control. Seminole resistance was not effortless. Crops were destroyed, cattle were seized. Families were forced to move repeatedly. Hunger and exhaustion grew, but survival itself became strategy. If the United States could not force removal quickly, then every month of resistance proved that the Treaty of Payne's Landing had not settled Florida. For Black Seminoles, the stakes remained immediate and personal. Some fought, some scouted, some translated, some protected families and food stores. Their presence kept the conflict tied to slavery as well as land. U.S. officers wanted military victory. Southern slaveholders wanted people captured and returned. Seminole leaders wanted a future in which their allies were not abandoned. The war's center was therefore not only the battlefield. It was the question of whether freedom communities could survive inside an expanding slaveholding republic. While Florida burned, removal continued across the Southeast. In Alabama and Georgia, the Creek crisis worsened in 1836. The Treaty of Coacoochee had broken Creek land into individual allotments. But the promise of orderly transition collapsed under fraud, debt, settler violence, and illegal occupation. Many Creek families found themselves dispossessed before removal even formally began. When some resisted, American authorities treated the crisis as rebellion. Federal and state power moved together. Militia, soldiers, speculators, and officials forced the issue. Thousands of Creeks were marched west under military guard. Families left fields, towns, and burial grounds under conditions shaped by coercion and fear. The removal was not a clean administrative transfer. It was a human rupture. The Cherokee Nation faced the next tightening ring. A small faction signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, ceding Cherokee lands and agreeing to removal. Most Cherokee people and the principal leadership under John Ross rejected the treaty as illegitimate. They petitioned, protested, and insisted that a minority faction had no right to sell the nation. The United States treated the treaty as binding. This repeated the old pattern with devastating force. A contested signature became a national policy. A divided council became a weapon. The same federal government that had heard Cherokee legal arguments now prepared to enforce Cherokee dispossession. Florida Seminoles understood this pattern. The Treaty of Payne's Landing had also been disputed. The United States had also treated contested consent as final. Across the Southeast, removal policy did not wait for genuine agreement. It searched for enough paper to justify power. By 1837, the war in Florida and the pressure on the Cherokee were not separate episodes. They were different fronts in the same transformation. The United States remaking the Southeast for settlement, slavery, and state authority. As the war dragged on, American commanders increasingly turned to negotiation, deception, and removal by capture. General Thomas Jessup became one of the central figures in this phase. He understood that chasing Seminole fighters through Florida could continue indefinitely, so he used talks, promises, pressure on food supplies, and the seizure of leaders to break resistance networks. In 1837, Osceola came in under a flag of truce near St. Augustine. He was seized. To many Americans, Osceola had become the face of the war. Dramatic, defiant, impossible to ignore. To Seminoles and allies, his capture under truce confirmed what they already feared about U.S. promises. If a white flag could become a trap, then negotiation itself became dangerous. Osceola was imprisoned first at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, and later moved to Fort Moultrie near Charleston. He died there in early 1838, far from the Florida homelands he had refused to leave. His death did not end the war. That was the lesson American commanders struggled to absorb. Osceola mattered deeply, but Seminole resistance was larger than one man. Micanopy, Coacoochee, Abiaka, Alligator, Jumper, Halleck Tustanuggy, and many others remained part of the conflict's continuing life. Black Seminole leaders and communities also kept shaping strategy and survival. The seizure of leaders produced removals. It also produced bitterness and renewed distrust. Every captured chief, every broken promise, every forced march made clear that the United States was willing to treat diplomacy as another weapon. The war had entered a harsher phase, not a quick victory, a campaign of attrition. In December 1837, Colonel Zachary Taylor led U.S. troops into South Florida. Taylor's column moved through difficult country toward Lake Okeechobee, searching for Seminole forces and hoping to deliver the kind of blow that earlier campaigns had failed to achieve. The march itself showed the Army's problem. The farther troops moved into Florida, the more the landscape stripped away confidence. Mud, water, sawgrass, heat, and confusion turned movement into labor. On Christmas Day, Taylor's force met Seminole fighters near Lake Okeechobee. The fighting was fierce. Seminole warriors used the terrain well, firing from cover behind sawgrass and trees. U.S. troops pushed forward at heavy cost. Taylor claimed victory because his force held the field. But the battle did not destroy Seminole resistance. Many fighters withdrew. The war continued. Okeechobee made Taylor famous. It helped carry him toward national prominence and eventually the presidency. But as a military solution, it revealed the same contradiction that had defined the war from the beginning. The United States could win a battle and still fail to end the conflict. For Seminoles and Black Seminoles, withdrawal was not the same as defeat. Survival remained the strategic core. If families, leaders, and fighters could continue beyond the battlefield, then removal remained incomplete. The battle also showed how costly Florida had become. Men died or fell wounded in a war many Americans had expected to be small. Money poured into forts, roads, expeditions, and supply lines. The campaign consumed attention without delivering closure. Okeechobee gave the United States a hero. It did not give the United States Florida on its own terms. While the Seminole War continued, the Cherokee removal reached its darkest moment. In 1838, federal troops under General Winfield Scott moved into Cherokee country to enforce the Treaty of New Echota. Cherokee families were rounded up into camps. Homes were abandoned. Farms and possessions were left behind or taken by others. The nation that had fought through law, diplomacy, newspapers, petitions, and constitutional government was forced west. The journey became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands suffered from hunger, exposure, disease, grief, and exhaustion. Many died. The removal was not one single road, but a network of detachments, routes, camps, delays, river crossings, and terrible choices. It tore a people from homeland while proving that legal argument and adaptation had not protected them from federal force. The Cherokee removal echoed through the entire Indian removal era. It showed that even the most visible legal resistance could be overridden. It showed how a contested treaty could become the instrument of national policy. It showed how the language of civilization and protection could coexist with soldiers at doorways and families in stockades. In Florida, Seminoles had already feared this future. Now it was happening elsewhere in full view. The Trail of Tears also revealed the moral cost of the War of 1812's aftermath. The republic that celebrated independence and expansion used its growing power to uproot nations inside its borders. The same era that produced national heroes also produced national wounds. The War of 1812 had ended in 1815, but the struggle over the continent had not ended at all. After Osceola's capture and death, resistance continued under other leaders. Coacoochee, also known as Wildcat, became one of the most remarkable figures of the later war. Captured at one point and imprisoned at Fort Marion, he escaped with others in a daring flight that became part of Seminole memory. His resistance showed again that the war could not be reduced to one famous leader or one dramatic moment. Abiaka, often called Sam Jones by Americans, also remained important. Older, elusive, and deeply rooted in the southern Florida world, he symbolized the refusal to submit even after years of pressure. U.S. officers found it difficult to force decisive terms on people who could retreat into landscapes the army barely understood. The Everglades and Big Cypress country became central to the war's later phase. These were not empty hiding places. They were lived landscapes of water, islands, tree hammocks, trails, food knowledge, and seasonal movement. Seminole and Black Seminole communities used them to survive military pressure. American strategy became harsher. Troops built roads and forts, destroyed crops, seized cattle, captured families, and tried to starve resistance into surrender. Some commanders used negotiation, others used pursuit. Some even experimented with bloodhounds imported from Cuba, a choice that horrified critics and revealed how desperate the war had become. Removals continued in pieces. Captured leaders and families were sent west. Some Black Seminoles were separated, claimed, negotiated over, or removed under uncertain protections. The question of freedom followed them beyond Florida. Yet a core Seminole presence remained. The United States could reduce resistance. It could not erase it. By 1842, the United States had spent years, lives, and enormous sums trying to force the Seminoles from Florida. Many had been removed west. Many had died. Communities had been shattered. The war left deep scars across Florida and across the native South. But the United States did not achieve complete removal. A smaller Seminole population remained in Florida, especially in the southern wetlands. That fact mattered. The Second Seminole War ended less like a triumphant conquest than an exhausted decision to stop. Officials declared the main war over, reduced military operations, and accepted what they had once denied. Some Seminoles would remain. The map had changed. The population had changed. The power balance had changed. But Seminole survival in Florida endured. The larger Indian removal era continued to shape the West. Native nations removed from the Southeast rebuilt under painful conditions. Political struggles followed them. Slavery followed some communities west. Old divisions deepened. New towns, governments, farms, and conflicts emerged from displacement. For the United States, removal opened millions of acres to cotton, settlement, speculation, and slavery. It also left a legacy of broken treaties and forced migration that would never be morally settled by legal paperwork. The War of 1812 series has traveled from Impressment and Tecumseh to Detroit and New Orleans, to Horseshoe Bend, to Florida, to removal, to the Everglades. The through line is power. Who could claim land? Who could make law? Whose freedom counted? Whose treaties would be honored? Whose homes could be renamed frontier? Episode 4 now ends where the era itself refuses a clean ending. With families gone west, families still hidden in Florida, and a republic larger than before, but burdened by what expansion had required. The United States called it removal. The people forced to live it remembered roads, rivers, graves, hunger, smoke, resistance, and survival.